My name is Daniel Mercer. For 7 years, I was the sheriff of Hollow Creek, a quiet mining town tucked deep into the hills of West Virginia. I thought I'd seen every kind of crime this place could throw at me. Drunken fights outside the only bar, petty thefts at the hardware store, the occasional domestic call that ended with more paperwork than arrests. But nothing in my badge years, or in the years I wore a different uniform overseas, prepared me for what I found here. Because Hollow Creek isn't just a coal town. It's a town with a memory, and it remembers the dead. Hey everyone, before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It really helps YouTube keep showing you more stories like this. All right, let's get started. On paper, we're known for a mine explosion that happened back in 1912, a tragedy that killed 37 miners in the middle of a night shift. The official story says it was a buildup of methane gas, a freak accident that could have happened anywhere. That's what the company told the newspapers, anyway. It's what's carved into the plaque at the memorial downtown. But if you talk to the right people, or maybe the wrong ones, you hear another version. One where the explosion wasn't an accident. One where only certain men, the ones organizing for safer conditions and fair pay, were on the roster that night. Men who'd been warned not to push their luck just days before they died. I used to think those whispers were just part of Hollow Creek's folklore, the way small towns cling to old grudges and ghost stories. Then I found proof. Proof that the explosion was planned, executed, and covered up, not just by the coal company, but by a small circle of men whose families still run this town over a century later. We call them the Pact. Not officially, of course. The name doesn't appear in any records. But everyone knows who they are, or at least what they are. They own the land, the businesses, the law. They control who gets jobs, who keeps them, and who disappears without a trace. And they've been keeping their grip for generations. I wish I could tell you this ended in handcuffs and justice served. But Hollow Creek isn't that kind of place. It's the kind where people vanish into the hills, where fires start in empty houses in the middle of the night, where bad breaks send trucks off ravines. And if you're from Hollow Creek, you already know this isn't just a story. It's a message. Before Hollow Creek, my life was about structure, chain of command, and the comfort of knowing where the threats were coming from. I served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. By the time I came home, my chest was heavy with ribbons I didn't much care for, and my knees were shot from too many years carrying gear through places that didn't want us there. I thought law enforcement would be an easier pace, something steady, grounded, and far from the sand and gunpowder. I took the sheriff's badge in Hollow Creek in 2013. It's the kind of place where outsiders are noticed instantly and where every last name carries history. Some of those names are carved into headstones, others on plaques in front of brick buildings, and a few are whispered in ways that tell you not to repeat them. The town itself is a single main street lined with weathered brick storefronts and faded awnings. There's a diner that still serves coffee for $1, a barbershop that doubles as a news network, and a grocery store that smells faintly of coal dust because the trucks pass right by on their way to the processing plant. Hollow Creek's lifeblood has always been coal, and its chokehold has always been the families who own it. Mayor Elias Hartwell is the most visible of them. His grandfather, Clarence Hartwell, was the mine's foreman in 1912, and Elias wears that heritage like a crown. Always dressed in dark tailored suits. Even at town picnics, he's the kind of man who shakes your hand while sizing you up. Around here, his word carries more weight than any council vote. People say he's charming when he wants to be, but I've only seen the charm when there's a camera nearby. Then there's Nora Briggs. She's well into her 80s, wiry, and always wearing a faded army jacket that isn't military issue but carries a dozen pins like it should be. Nora runs the Hollow Creek Historical Society out of a converted church basement, and she has a habit of telling newcomers the truth about the town. Most people brush her off as paranoid, but she remembers dates, names, and details with unnerving accuracy. She was the first person to ever mention the Pact to me, but she did it in a whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening. Claire Hartwell is the mayor's daughter, though you'd never know it from her quiet, plain way of dressing. She teaches English at the high school, runs the drama club, and volunteers at the library. I met her during a town fundraiser, and she struck me as polite but guarded, like someone always editing her words before she speaks. Later, I learned that being a Hartwell in Hollow Creek means knowing more than you say and deciding daily whether you can live with that. The pact wasn't something people explained. It was something they avoided, like a sinkhole you just walk around without asking how it got there. In my first year as sheriff, I'd catch half-finished sentences when certain names came up, see people glance over their shoulders before changing the subject. At first, I thought it was just small-town superstition. I know better now. It was late October when the first real crack appeared in Hollow Creek's surface. The call came in just after dawn. Teenagers had been messing around near the old Black Hollow mine and spray-painted the gate. Normally, that kind of thing wouldn't rate more than a quick check, but the voice on the phone was tight, almost rehearsed. You might want to see this for yourself, Sheriff. The Black Hollow shaft had been sealed since the early 80s, or so the records claimed. The entrance sat halfway up a hillside, framed by skeletal trees and wrapped in chain-link fencing. As I pulled up in the cruiser, the air smelled faintly of rust and wet stone. Sure enough, the gate had been tagged with sloppy red paint, but that's not what caught my attention. Just beyond the fence, in the mud, were boot prints. Fresh ones, deep impressions from someone heavier than a teenager, leading straight toward the boarded-over mine entrance. The boards themselves weren't weathered like I expected. They looked newer, like they'd been replaced within the last few years. I climbed through the fence, my breath clouding in the cold morning air. The boards came away easier than they should have, and behind them, a narrow tunnel yawned into darkness. I told myself I was just making sure no kids were inside, but every step echoed too loudly against the rock. About 30 feet in, my flashlight beam caught something metallic in the dust, an old lockbox dented and streaked with rust. I crouched, brushed away the dirt, and saw that the latch had been forced open recently. Inside were black and white photographs of miners, their faces smudged with coal dust, eyes sharp even through the grain of the film. Tucked between the photos were handwritten notes on brittle paper, meeting times, names I didn't recognize, and one sheet with today's date scrawled in red pencil and circled twice. A cold draft curled through the tunnel, carrying a faint scent of oil and damp earth. I flipped through the photos again, and my pulse ticked higher when I noticed something. Every man pictured wore the same brass pin on his shirt, a circular emblem with a pickaxe crossed over a coal cart. I'd never seen that symbol before, but something about it felt deliberate, official. That's when I heard it. A low scrape of boots against stone. Then a voice, deep and steady, from somewhere farther in the mine. "You're not supposed to be here, Sheriff." I froze, every muscle locking tight. The beam from my flashlight wavered against the walls. I called out, "This is county property. Step into the light." But the only response was the faint drip of water deeper inside. I backed toward the entrance, keeping my light aimed down the tunnel. When I finally stepped back into the daylight, the hillside seemed too still, too quiet. I half expected to see someone waiting outside, but there was nothing, no figure, no fresh footprints leading out. Just mine. I locked the box in my cruiser and radio dispatched that the site was clear, though my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. That night, I pulled the lockbox onto my kitchen table and went through the papers again. The names on the list, the strange symbol, and that circled date, it felt less like history and more like a schedule. And I had the uneasy feeling that I'd just been noticed by people who didn't like being seen. The morning after I found the lockbox, I started asking questions. At the diner, I brought up the vandalism to a couple of regulars who worked at the processing plant. "You ever hear anything about someone using the Black Hollow shaft lately?" I asked, trying to keep it casual. One of them, a wiry man named Dale, stirred his coffee without looking up. "Sealed up years ago," he muttered. The other just shook his head and changed the subject to the upcoming football game. It was the same pattern all over town, a flash of discomfort, then a quick pivot away from the topic. The old-timers would glance at each other like they'd heard something but weren't about to share it with me. Even younger folks, people with no reason to know the mine's history, seemed to instinctively clam up. I decided to take the lockbox to the only person in town I trusted to tell me what she knew, Nora Briggs. I found her in the Historical Society basement, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and boxes labeled in her neat, looping handwriting. She looked at the photographs for all of 10 seconds before her lips pressed into a thin line. "These men," she said, tapping one of the photos, "they were the union's backbone. All of them were pushing for safer conditions. The night the mine exploded, they were the only ones on shift. Everyone else, the company men, the foreman's favorites, was reassigned earlier that day. Officially, it was due to scheduling needs." "You're saying they were targeted," I said. "I'm saying," she replied, her voice low, "that the explosion did more than kill those men. It killed the union. And it made a handful of families very, very rich." She dug through a drawer and pulled out a worn ledger of property deeds. Page after page showed the same pattern: land, mineral rights, and company stock quietly changing hands in the year after the explosion. The Hartwells, the Monroes, the Clydes, names that still carried weight in Hollow Creek. "These families still own half the county," Nora said. "They own the mine, the banks, the land under our feet. And if you look close, you'll see something else. Their bloodlines haven't gone anywhere. Their children stay here, run the businesses, marry into each other's families. It's a closed circle." I went back to my office and started cross-referencing the names in Nora's ledger with public records. She was right. The same families controlled nearly every major institution in town. The bank president was a Clyde. The high school principal was a Monroe. The mayor, of course, was a Hartwell. Even the local newspaper editor was married into the Monroe line. The more I looked, the more it felt like a web. Every road I followed led back to the same cluster of names, the same handful of addresses on the wealthier side of town. And none of them had ever left Hollow Creek, not for long. That night, I laid the photos from the lockbox out on my kitchen table again. Every man in them was dead now, their fight for safer conditions erased from the official record. In their place, the descendants of the people who'd profited from their deaths sat in positions of power, smiling for ribbon cuttings and holiday parades. The mine explosion wasn't just history. It was the foundation this town was built on. And the people who built it were still here, still in charge. It was just after sunset when Claire Hartwell showed up at my office door. She was still in her work clothes, a plain gray cardigan over a floral blouse, but her hair was pulled back hastily like she'd left in a hurry. She glanced up and down the hallway before stepping inside. "You've been asking about the Black Hollow mine," she said without preamble. "You need to stop." I leaned back in my chair. "That sounds like something your father would say." Her jaw tightened. "If you keep asking questions, you'll end up like the others." I studied her face. There was fear there, but something else too, a decision she'd already made before walking through my door. She reached in her bag and pulled out a weathered leather ledger, its cover cracked and dry. The edges were frayed, and the spine looked like it might crumble if handled too roughly. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said, setting it on my desk. "I shouldn't have it. My father doesn't know I found it." I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting, dated entries stretching from the late 1940s through the 70s. At first, it read like a business record, notes on land sales, investments, meetings with other local families. But the farther I read, the darker it became. One entry from 1953 detailed a problem with a school board member who was too sympathetic to union rhetoric. 2 weeks later, the man died in what was described in the town paper as a hunting accident. Another entry from 1961 mentioned a fire that destroyed a boarding house occupied by dissenters. The fire marshal ruled it electrical, but here it was noted as approved and carried out. Mixed in with the dates and names were clear records of bribes, payments to county officials, bank loans forgiven for friendly families, campaign donations that were nothing more than buy-offs. I flipped toward the back of the ledger, where the handwriting became more deliberate, as if each letter was written for the record. There I found a list of surnames under the heading Marked Families. Some I recognized from the photos in the lockbox. Others were still in town, running small businesses, working at the plant, never rising high enough to challenge the old guard. Next to several names were the words resolved or neutralized. Claire had been standing quietly while I read, her hands clasped in front of her. "The pact," she said finally, I looked up. That's what this is? She nodded. They don't call it that officially, but it's what it is. Every few decades, they tighten their grip. Anyone who threatens their control over the land, the mineral rights, the money, disappears. Sometimes it's an accident. Sometimes it's just pressure, enough to make people leave. I turned to the last page. In bold, careful letters, one phrase was written at the top. Annual gathering. Confirmation of loyalty. Beneath it were dates spanning decades, always in late autumn. The most recent one was coming up in less than 2 weeks. Claire leaned closer. That's when they decide who stays protected and who doesn't. The first sign they knew I'd been digging came 3 days after Claire handed me the ledger. I was heading back from call in the next county, driving the switchback road that snakes down from Pikes Ridge. The sun was setting, the valley below washed in orange when I tapped the brakes before a sharp curve, and the pedal went straight to the floor. For a split second, my mind went blank. Then instinct took over. I downshifted hard, fought the wheel, and steered toward the gravel shoulder. The cruiser skidded, fishtailing dangerously close to the guardrail before coming to a shuddering stop. My hands were shaking when I climbed out. One look at the front well told me it wasn't bad luck. The brake line had been cleanly severed. I had the cruiser towed into town, filed a report, and told the mechanic to photograph everything. By the next morning, the tow yard had been broken into, and the photos were gone. No one saw who did it. When I got to my office, there was a plain white envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words typed in block letters. You've been warned once. The rest of that day, every time I saw a car in my rearview mirror for more than a mile, my pulse kicked up. That night, I parked the cruiser 2 blocks from my house and walked the last stretch in the dark. The next week, I started noticing a black SUV around town. Newer model, tinted windows, no plates on the front. It would appear in my side mirror when I left the station, parked half a block down from the diner when I stopped for lunch. Once, I saw it idling outside the Historical Society while Nora was inside alone. One night, just past 10 p.m., I saw it heading out toward the old Black Hollow mine. I followed at a distance, keeping my headlights low. The SUV turned off onto an overgrown service road I hadn't noticed before, one that ran behind the mine entrance and curved toward the hillside. I killed my engine and coasted to a stop, far enough back to stay hidden. Through the brush, I could just make out a wide steel door set into the rock face, partly hidden by ivy and timber beams. The SUV rolled up, and someone inside tapped the code into a keypad. The door slid open silently. Out stepped Mayor Elias Hartwell, wearing a dark overcoat despite the mild night. Behind him were 3 other men I recognized from town: the bank president Clyde, the high school principal Monroe, and a county judge named Barrett. They moved with an ease that told me this wasn't their first visit. One by one, they disappeared through the door. Before it closed, I caught a glimpse of warm yellow light spilling into the tunnel beyond, and the faint sound of voices echoing off stone. I sat there in the dark for a long minute, staring at the sealed door. Whatever was going on in that tunnel wasn't vandalism or nostalgia. It was business, and it was the kind of business people were willing to cut brake lines to protect. 2 nights after seeing Mayor Hartwell and the others slip into that hidden tunnel, I went back. I parked half a mile away, hiked the rest under cover of darkness, and waited in the trees until the last light in town faded. The steel door was shut tight, the keypad faintly glowing in the dark. I'd memorized the code from watching Hartwell punch it in, quick movements, but I'd seen enough to piece it together. The lock clicked. The door opened without a sound, and I slipped inside. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls reinforced with timber beams that looked newer than the mine itself. The air was warmer here, carrying a faint scent of cigars and something metallic. About 50 feet in, the passage opened into a wide chamber carved directly into the rock. It was nothing like I'd imagined. A long oak table stretched across the center, polished to a deep sheen. Leather chairs, each with a brass nameplate, ringed the table. Along the walls hung framed black and white portraits of stern-faced men, the original Pact members, if Nora's stories were true. Their eyes followed, no matter where you stood. At the far end of the room, A smaller alcove held filing cabinets and a locked glass case displaying what looked like ledgers and bound volumes, much like the one Claire had given me. I moved quietly along the wall, keeping to the shadows. Footsteps echoed from a side passage, followed by voices. I ducked behind one of the cabinets just as a group of men entered. Hartwell led them, shedding his overcoat as he took his seat at the head of the table. Clyde, Monroe, and Judge Barrett followed, along with 3 others I didn't recognize. The conversation started with small talk about property taxes and zoning approvals, but it shifted quickly. That reporter from Charleston, Monroe said, is asking too many questions about the old deeds. Wants to know why so many mineral rights were transferred in 13 and 14. Hartwell leaned back, steepling his fingers. Then she's a problem, and problems don't last long in Hollow Creek. Judge Barrett's voice was low, almost casual. We could bury her in litigation for years. Or, he let the word hang. Clyde chuckled without humor. Or we could do what we've always done. Pressure her sources, cut her funding, dry her out until she folds. Hartwell shook his head. She's stubborn. If she won't take a settlement, we escalate. Accidents happen. Houses burn. People move away for their own good. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. At that moment, it hit me. This was a nostalgia for old power. It wasn't ceremonial. The pact was alive, fully operational, and running Hollow Creek like a corporation that just happened to dabble in intimidation, corruption, and, if necessary, murder. I eased back toward the tunnel, every muscle wired tight. I'd come looking for proof the pact still existed. What I found was worse. Proof they were still adding names to their list. By the time I reached the door and slipped outside, my pulse was pounding in my ears. The air felt colder, sharper, like the hills themselves knew what I'd just seen. If they'd kill a journalist for asking the wrong questions, I didn't have to wonder what they'd do to a sheriff caught spying in their inner sanctum. 2 days after I slipped into the tunnel, Claire called me from a block number. Her voice was tense, clipped. "Come to my house," she said. "Now." When I pulled up to the Hartwell estate, the place was dark except for a faint light in one upstairs window. Claire let me in through a side door and led me straight to her father's study. Elias Hartwell was behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. He didn't look surprised to see me. "What's this about?" I asked. Claire didn't sit. She stood in front of the desk, arms crossed, her voice trembling with anger. "I know what you're doing, Dad. I know about the meetings. About the pact." Hartwell's expression barely shifted. "That word again," he said with a faint smile. "Your friend the sheriff put that in your head?" "This isn't a story. It's real," she said. "You're still hurting people. Still taking what doesn't belong to you." Hartwell set his glass down, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Claire, without the pact, this town dies. And so do we. Do you think Hollow Creek survives on goodwill? Without control, the unions would be back, the lawsuits would never stop, and the land would be stripped from us. Everything we built would vanish." "You mean everything you stole?" she shot back. For the first time, his voice hardened. "You have no idea what it takes to hold a place like this together. Sacrifices have to be made. Always have been. Always will be." I stepped in then, my voice steady. "Sacrifice isn't the word you're looking for." Hartwell's gaze flicked to me. "Careful, Sheriff. You've been poking around where you don't belong. You think the state police will save you? Half of them owe their careers to families at this table. You'd be lucky to last a month after filing a report." He wasn't bluffing, and I knew it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep this went. The county judge was at those meetings. The bank president, a principal who could bury records. If I went through official channels, the case wouldn't just disappear. So would I. Back outside, Claire walked me to my truck. The night air was cool, the silence heavy between us. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "If I go to the wrong person, it's over before it starts. But if I wait too long, they'll find a way to shut you up," she finished. I met her eyes. "You too. You're the mayor's daughter. If they think you've picked a side, you'll be treated like any other threat." She didn't flinch. "Then we'd better make our move before they make theirs." I drove away from the Hartwell estate with my hands tight on the wheel, every headlight in the rear view feeling like a tail. I knew we were past the point of warning shots. The pact wasn't just guarding secrets. It was preparing to protect them at any cost. And if we weren't careful, the next accident in Hollow Creek would have our names on it. It was Nora Briggs' death that broke whatever hesitation I had left. I got the call early on a Thursday morning. She'd been found at the bottom of the stone steps behind the Historical Society, her body twisted, her neck broken. The official report said she tripped while carrying boxes to her car. I went to the scene myself. The steps were steep, but Nora had walked them 1,000 times. I found one of her shoes halfway up, the strap torn clean through. The tear wasn't frayed like it had worn out. It was sharp like it had been sliced. The coroner, a man who owed his position to the mayor, barely looked at her before signing off on accidental fall. When I asked about bruising on her forearms, he just shrugged. She must have hit the railing on the way down. I didn't believe it for a second. Nora had been helping me connect the dots. Now she was gone, and the message was clear. Anyone who talked was fair game. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the ledger Claire had given me. I flipped to the last page again. Annual gathering, confirmation of loyalty. The date was in 3 days. If I wanted to bring the pact down, I couldn't rely on rumors or circumstantial history. I needed hard proof, photos, recordings, documents with signatures. And the gathering would be the one time all of them were together in that tunnel. I knew the risks. If they caught me inside, I wouldn't be walking out. But after Nora, the choice didn't feel like mine anymore. The night of the gathering, I parked my truck in the trees a mile from the mine. I wore dark clothes, gloves, and carried a small camera, a voice recorder, and a flashlight with a red filter. From my vantage point, I watched the members arrive. The same black SUV, a couple of unmarked sedans, and even the judge's own county-issued car. They went through the steel door one by one, entering their code like clockwork. I waited until the last tail light disappeared before moving. The keypad beeped under my fingers, the door sliding open to reveal the sloping tunnel. I kept to the edge, my boots silent against the packed earth. When I reached the main chamber, the voices were already carrying from deeper inside. The oak table was set with neat stacks of folders, glasses of whiskey, and an open ledger with fresh ink glistening on the page. I snapped photos quickly, my hands steady despite the hammering in my chest. Then I followed the voices toward the side room. The air was warmer here, the sound of conversation low but distinct. I raised the recorder and let it run, catching every word. Discussions about property seizures, about neutralizing a contractor who'd refused a buyout, about donations funneled through shell companies. One voice, Hartwell's, stood out. We handle dissent now, and we handle it quietly. No more messes like Briggs. That was sloppy. I stayed in the shadows until the meeting shifted to toasts and handshakes. Then I retraced my steps, slipping back up the tunnel, heart pounding with each footfall. By the time the steel door closed behind me, I knew two things. I had enough evidence to make a move, and the clock was ticking before they realized someone had been in the room with them. I was halfway to the tree lean when I heard it, the metallic echo of the steel door behind me. Hey, a voice barked, sharp and close. I didn't look back. I broke into a run, the crunch of boots on gravel closing the distance. My truck was parked farther than I liked, but I made it to the shadows of the pines before a flashlight beam swept past where I'd been seconds earlier. I cut across the ridge, moving fast but quiet, until the mine road was out of sight. Only then did I let myself breathe. In my pocket, the recorder was still running, and the camera's memory card held dozens of photos. The open ledger, the stacks of files Hartwell's faced mid-sentence. I knew I couldn't sit on it. By morning, they'd realized someone had been in that chamber, and my name would be at the top of their list. I called a contact I'd met years earlier, a reporter named Rachel Keene who worked out of Charleston. She didn't know the pact anything. We met at a rest stop an hour outside Hollow Creek. I handed over the recorder, the memory card, and a written account of everything I'd seen. She promised to make copies in multiple places before publishing. I drove home under a low, cold sky, thinking maybe I'd bought myself a little time. I was wrong. At 3:14 a.m., I woke to the crackle of fire and the smell of smoke. Flames licked the front windows of my house, heat searing the air. I grabbed my jacket, bolted out the back, and didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's yard. By the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, the place was gone. They called it an electrical fault. I didn't bother arguing. The next evening, Rachel's story went live. The audio clips were front and center. Hartwell discussing neutralizing people, Barrett talking about accidents, Monroe laughing about pressure. The photos showed the oak table, the ledgers, the portraits of the original members staring down like silent judges. The story hit national news within hours. Hollow Creek was suddenly a headline. Century-old secret society still runs West Virginia town. But the victory was short-lived. Hartwell held a press conference, called the recordings deepfakes generated by political opponents, and claimed the photos were digitally altered. Barrett and the others stood beside him, their faces solemn, their denials rehearsed. No arrests were made. No investigations opened. By the end of the week, Rachel told me she was getting calls from unknown numbers, warning her to drop the Hollow Creek piece. She sent me a burner phone and told me to get out. I left the same night, driving west until the hills flattened and the town's name stopped appearing on road signs. I found work under an alias, kept my head down, but the Pact didn't forget. Every few months, an unmarked envelope shows up at whatever P.O. box I'm using. Inside, there's always a single photo, me stepping out of a store, walking to my truck, sitting in a diner booth. The angles are different, but the message is the same. They know where I am, and they're letting me know they know. The thing about the Pact is they've survived for more than a century because they've learned how to blend in. They don't wear masks or carry guns in the street. They don't need to. In 1912, it was dynamite in a mine shaft. In 1953, it was a hunting accident. In the 80s, it was a fire blamed on faulty wiring. Today, it's lawsuits that drain you dry, bank loans that vanish overnight, IRS audits that come out of nowhere. And if all that fails, accidents still happen. That's why most people in Hollow Creek keep quiet. You don't fight something like this head on. You learn to live with it, or you leave. The ones who stay silent get to keep their jobs, their homes, their families. The ones who speak up, well, Nora Briggs is proof enough of that. I've replayed that night in the tunnel in my head 100 times. I think about the portraits on the wall, those men who started it all. I wonder if they knew their great-grandchildren would still be carrying out their work, still protecting the same stolen wealth. Or maybe they knew exactly what they were building, a legacy that could survive any law, any change in government, because it was stitched into the very fabric of the town. I'm under no illusion that I've stopped them. The story's out there, sure, but in a place like Hollow Creek, truth is just another thing they can bury. They've weathered worse than me. What I did was plant a seed. And maybe someday, someone with more reach, more resources will come along and water it. Until then, I live with the fact that my name's probably still in one of their ledgers, maybe underlined, maybe marked for later. I move often, keep my circle small, and never park my truck in the same spot 2 nights in a row. If you're watching this, you might be wondering if any of it's real. If Hollow Creek exists, if the Pact is still meeting in that tunnel. Maybe it's just a story, something to pass the time. That's what they want you to think. But here's the thing. Every small town has its own version of the Pact. A few families who seem to own everything, control everything, and never seem to face the consequences the rest of us do. If you're from a town like mine, ask yourself one question. Who's really in charge? And if you already know the answer, be careful who you tell.